go. Hi there. Welcome to Creating the Future's first meeting of 2020.
Wow.
Pretty awesome. Pretty awesome. I am Hilda Gottlieb with Creating the Future, and we will all say hello and introduce ourselves. And I just want to let anybody who may be watching know that you can be part of the meeting by tweeting to the hashtag Creating the Future. And we will be watching for those tweets and incorporate your stuff into the meeting. If you happen to be watching this afterwards, tweet to us, put comments in the blog, be part of the conversation, because that's where the good stuff is. That's where the fun is. Let's go around and if you will say who you are, where you were located, and something exciting and awesome in your life. And I'm gonna start. I am Hilda Gottlieb. I am in Tucson, Arizona, where it is beautiful and sunny, and we are enjoying the desert. And I am going to share my awesome, which unfortunately Vu is not here yet for the meeting, but we were all together last week in the desert. So that was my awesome. Among others, many other awesomes, but it was just delicious and delightful to go out into the desert and play. And so he will be with us when he's done dropping his kids off of school, because there's apparently snow in Seattle. But that is high on my awesome list. I always love when our friends come to see us and we get to play. So. Who is next? Tell us where you are located and something awesome that's going on in your life.
Okay, I'll go next. So I'm Carl Wilding. I'm just outside London in England, where the weather is wet and rainy and blustery, and it's now dark because it's just after 6 p.m. in the evening here. My awesome, I guess, is that I'm about 3 months now into the job of being the chief exec of the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, which is sort of a non-profit umbrella body here. And it's really good just going out and talking to people, but actually I'm doing something that Hildy and the rest of the board advised me to do before I got the job, which is I'm listening more than anything. And when you go out and listen to people and you hear about what they do, you know, you hear your fair share of problems and things going wrong and so on, but my God, it gets you here. All the brilliant stuff that you hear about, where people are doing stuff in spite of what we sort of do, where we think we're supporting them, or in spite of what the state does, or in spite of what the non-profit sector does. And this stuff, it's really life affirming. So if there's one thing I've learned from my last 3 months, it's, for God's sake, go out and talk to people and listen to them and find out what they're doing, because it just makes you realize that we're doing this stuff for a reason.
I'm so excited you're in that position that I get giggly just thinking about it.
That's awesome. I'll go next, I think. Yeah. Hi, Angie. My name's Angie Eikenberry, and I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, where it is somewhat sunny, cloudy-ish. The snow covering everything right now. It just snowed again last night. The semester is starting today, so that's awesome. And my other awesome is that my daughter, my only daughter, turned 16 last week. So it's just amazing how life goes by so quickly, and she's amazing. So yeah, it's pretty exciting times.
Wow. Big stuff. Elizabeth, how about you?
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Sadlon. I'm in Los Angeles, where our chili doesn't even fit with the context of snow at all. It's a beautiful blue sky sunny day. I'm an independent consultant here and have been connected with Hildy and Dimitri for many years, and I appreciate the invitation to join this board meeting in the last one. And my awesome, last week, I got to participate in a housing justice LA summit, I guess is what it was. It was an all-day conference that really modeled inclusion and voice and listening and engaging in ways that I was really, I learned a lot from both how it was designed and the conversations. Had spoken word, it had personal testimony, it had academic sharing, it had spontaneous music, and hope. And in this topic these days, hope is sometimes hard to find, but it was very grounded in action, as well as a very humbling comment from Colleen Echo Hawk, who is from Seattle. And I also think that Vu probably knows her. And she said, capacity building is paternalistic. We have capacity. What we need is your money. And so in reading the notes that you sent earlier, Hildy, about with the quotes around capacity building, it was a humbling way to think about what are the ways that I can bring gifts as an independent consultant in ways that recognize and build up the capacity that already exists.
Wow. Yep.
Thanks for inviting me to be here.
Wow. Wow. I would love to know more about just the whole summit, the whole how they did and what the results were, what they were planning. So we need to chat. Justin, hello.
Hello, Justin Pollock from Washington, D.C. Coming off of a 70-degree day yesterday, which was uncanny and crazy. But let's see, 2020. I think what's most exciting for me is I've started this year really revisiting, conceptual models that I've used and things that I've explored. And it started with a plane ride back from I'm always overly critical. It was not a failed training. It was a training that didn't go quite as well as I had hoped it would go. And it forced me to sort of sit down and say, well, what if I were to rebuild this all? I've been doing it for 10 years. Not that it hasn't been rebuilt multiple times, but what would happen if I started all over? And plane ride was, it was across the country. It was over in a minute in my head. And since then, I've been having fun drawing all over the walls, writing stuff. And so it's really exciting to kind of have a new way of doing sense making for myself around leadership and organizational capacity and all that stuff. So
Awesome.
And
So,
I will just as a note, I know we are intently human and intensely human here, but I'm about to eat, so I'm going to go dark. Well, so that you don't have to watch me actually chew. Sorry, Vu, I see that you just did that.
I can't guarantee that if I knock on something, I'm not going to be public about it.
Everybody watch Vu, and that's what I'm doing.
So we're going to rename our board meeting the Watch Everybody Eat meeting. I like it.
Yeah, there we go.
I like it. So I'm gonna flip right to Vu and say hello and welcome, and I will reshare what my awesome was. And my awesome was that we got to play together last week. So I just wanted to make sure you knew that that was my awesome.
Aw, thanks, Hildy.
How about you? Where are you? And apparently it is snowing. And what is awesome and exciting in your life these days?
Hi, everyone. My apologies for being late. It's snowing here in Seattle, so schools were delayed 2 hours. What's awesome? I had a great time in Tucson. Went to Miracle and the Saguaro Cactus Park with Hildy and Dimitri. And I don't know, it's always so majestic seeing the saguaros. They grow so slowly and they're just so great and patient, I guess. I'm eating some vegan ribs here, so apologies.
Because we're all human and you can eat. How about you, Dimitri? Where are you located? And
I am located in Tucson, Arizona, and actually like right next to you, the direction you are. I am sort of reflecting on this group. And
you know what? I'm gonna unmute and you you go. So one of the problems for anybody who's new to this is that Dimitri and I sit next to each other, and so we're going to have to mute and on off. Okay, go.
Just in reflecting on this group and what we're talking about, and the fact that it's 2020 and it's the beginning of a new decade, and that sort of struck home to me. We went to Tucson's very own Times Square on New Year's Eve, and it was an absolute riot. It was very fun. And one of the things that they do, and I will share with you, is instead of having the ball drop, they have a taco drop. And you can see the taco on the right-hand side of the picture that's on a giant crane. And when you hit midnight, the taco drops to the bottom and everybody jumps up and down. At the very bottom, I don't know if my cursor is visible, but there's a hand. You can sort of see the thumb underneath the taco. So it's very irreverent and silly and fun, but it struck me at the time when they said, we're welcoming a new decade. And so that's part of my awesome here, is that you know, we're looking at a new decade for not only our world, but also for us here. And I'm excited about that. And that's my awesome, is that we are together and moving into 2020.
It is pretty awesome. It is pretty awesome. I wanted to take a minute and just bring us sort of back up to speed and up to where we have been, where we are, where we're heading. We have been talking about, started out with what kind of structure would an organization need to be as we are looking to scale the impact of our mission. What kind of a structure would support that? And that led inevitably to asking, what is the role of a board within that? And led to our really talking about what are boards required to do, which isn't really very much. They're required to exist and not do anything illegal. That is like the entire law that we can find. Justin and I spent a lot of time a year or so ago talking to attorneys, talking to compliance people, and saying, what are we absolutely supposed to be doing as a board? And everybody across the board went, just don't get in trouble, don't do anything illegal. And so what we've been focusing on is a board that, a body that is around integrity and meeting people's expectations. We started with a conversation about compliance, legal compliance. We looked at some models around the world of boards that are really focused just on making sure that the organization is legally compliant. And we decided that that didn't sound like us, and a lot of conversation has gone on between many of us in the past couple of weeks since the last board meeting, when we started to say, you know, really looking at, are we walking the talk of our values? Are we walking the talk of what people expect of us? Are we being a body that is infused with integrity? And what does that look like if there is a body within the organization that is really focused on that integrity? One of the other things that has come up, Lou had a wonderful story last time about kids who were instructed to draw a fish. And in one case, they were told, draw a fish. And they drew all kinds of cool stuff. And in the other case, they were told, draw a fish. And here's just one example of what it might look like. And all the kids drew that fish. And use that example when talking about the fact that we're using words like board and governance that we all have a different idea and interpretation of, and we may individually have an idea of what we think a board is, and then we globally and culturally have an idea of what we think a board is, and that can't help but inform our thinking. The same with governance. I've been spending delightful time talking to the folks in Ontario at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, who actually have a endeavor they're calling I think reimagining governance. They've got a big thing at the top of their page that says governance does not equal board. which is sort of cool. But again, you wind up in these words that have like all kinds of meaning in our subconscious. And so I'm going to suggest that for our conversation today, that we stay away from the word board and we stay away from the word governance. And we really talk about this thing that we've been wanting to build, whether it is an integrity team, whether it is whatever we call it internally. Externally, we can call it whatever people think we need to call it. If the IRS wants to hear us call it a board, fine, we'll call it a board. But I'm going to say that for our purposes today, let's try and stay away from those terms, board and governance, and really dive into, we've spent the past several years really figuring out theoretically, what is this thing going to look like? What will the structure look like? And what will that body formerly known as look like? And I think it is time for us to build it. We've sort of danced around all of the theoretical edges of what does that function look like to make sure that we are being held in integrity. And so the things that I think we really need to dive into is, okay, what does it take to build that so that we can say, we can point to it and go, yep, that's it, and it's done, and it's got a check mark next to it. Things like bylaws, things like protocols, things like, all kinds of systems and people and who's going to do what, and et cetera. And so I just first want to say, is there anything that you all feel like I left out? Any comments, reflections on some of the conversations we've had since our last meeting, and then let's just dive in and say, what do we need to do to build this, and who's going to do it? So first, any reflections, any thoughts? Go, Carl.
I'm afraid I missed the last board meeting, but just hearing you sort of riffing on this sort of thing about these words, boards and governance, just a reflection on when we're thinking about volunteering and social change and sort of the future of our sector. And one of the things that keeps coming up time and time again is that lots of people are just not interested in this stuff. I mean, it's really off-putting. It's dead weight in terms of what we do, and that's not to say that it's not this stuff. We see how important it is, by virtue of the fact that when it's not there and things go wrong. But whatever we sort of end up with, I'm sort of very mindful of these words that keep ringing in my ears, that people keep saying to me about volunteering and getting involved, is that we're taking all the fun out of it. We're taking all the spontaneity out of it. And boards, quite frequently, they're a large part of that. So even if we have, to be blunt, some highfalutin ideas about what the future of governance should look like in our sector, there's something that's quite urgent that needs doing, because we are quite simply not attracting people to become trustees, board members, whatever, because it just doesn't fit with how they want to do social change. But at the same time, we've got to convince those people that this sort of governance and accountability, sorry to use the word, but there is a function there that serves a purpose, and we can't just leave it behind.
Yeah, I found it really interesting. We did have a lot of back and forth between all of us, and I'm going to write it up, or find somebody who can write up all of the ideas and thoughts that we sort of shared internally among each other over the past several weeks. Justin, I'm gonna quote you a little bit, because it was just so spot on, and we've all said it in different ways, and Vu has been talking about it a lot. One of the points, and we've talked about this a lot, is that boards are tasked with doing things that they don't really understand, that they don't really know how to do, that are completely outside their realm. And the line that just grabbed me, Justin, was when you said that, so who feels comfortable making decisions in these situations where they're basically pretending to know what they're doing? And your comment was, most white people, especially white men, are at ease feigning competency in decisions that they're not actually competent making. And I'm not sure that I would say that it's most white people or most white men, but I think a trait that you will find is that it is more likely to be found in the people that we find routinely in boards, who are primarily white men. One thing I also want to caution us on, as we are moving here from the theoretical to the practical for our board, is that we stay out of the realm of what boards and governance should be, and what is replicable. Right now, what is most of concern, I will tell you, to me, is what are we doing? And how are we doing it? And who's doing it? And for me, this is of particular importance, because as we seek to scale our impact, as we go from proof of concept, which is where we're right now in the middle, this middle land, and move towards really scaling our impact. The concern I have is that has to also move us from a reliance on me and Dimitri to a reliance on systems and networks. And this conversation that we're having at a very practical level of what is the body, what is the protocol, what are the ways in which we are adhering with integrity to what we say that we're about and the expectations people have, to me, that is absolutely integral to building those systems so that we don't have a huge networked thing that still relies on two people to sort of hold that glue together. So any other reflections on sort of the summary that I gave or anything that I left out? And then let's dive in and build, what does this look like for creating the future? What do we need to do? Yeah, Elizabeth.
Just a quick one. Loving the move to practicality, and I think this was probably for some dramatic effect, but we know that we're not going to get to a check the box and we're done. That there's always learning and change.
Of course there is.
Yeah.
Of course there is. Yeah, unfortunately, we're humans. If we were robots, it would be a lot easier.
Well, it's also, is this a static universe, or is this
Right.
a universe that's constantly in change? And,
Yeah.
and I think it's as much that as that's why we're human, because we deal with change.
Yep. So let's dig in. What are the things we're going to need? I think we're definitely gonna, and where do you want to start? I mean, I'm almost at the let's pick one and play with it and make it happen. Move to the next one.
So there is one thing that I think I want to add, because I know we've talked about the word integrity, and the word that I'm really using a lot with what I'm doing is efficacy, which I know is highfalutin and esoteric, but there's something about efficacy which is sort of, and I think about it in the medical realm, which is like, does this do what you say it's supposed to do? So I always, and I think about that a little bit more than just integrity, because, integrity is basically, am I holding to my beliefs? Am I holding to my values and what's important? Whereas I feel like efficacy really calls to question, hey, does it work? Like, is it actually doing what you say? So I certainly want to introduce that idea and say that, one of the things that we have to do is have a clear foundation of that which we have to have efficacy towards. So, the clarity of, certainly one of those principles, as Elizabeth was saying, of, it's learning, it's discovery, it's inquiry. So like, we know inquiry is a part of this. We know, I do sort of go back to that idea of, what democratizes it? What makes it so that those standard operating procedures, whatever they are, because we will construct something of that, lead to a very diverse and wide breadth of people being able to engage in it, as opposed to it being exclusionary, which I believe that's part of what my comment was. The current construct, I mean, we can go into all sorts of larger societal issues, but the current construct excludes. It narrows who is supposed to be able to do this. And so I want to make sure that part of what we are having efficacy towards is that democratization, and that we hold that. Like, we constantly keep asking ourselves, is this working the way we thought it was supposed to work?
I'm gonna just start keeping a doing list, sort of a parking lot doing list. One of the things that occurred to me as you were talking, Justin, is the democratizing and inclusion. We've set up a system where our meetings are open, where they're streamed, where anybody can participate. And at its ideal, that is by both invitation and announcement, by asking individual people, hey, we're going to be talking about this thing, I think you'd be interested, and being out in the world and saying, hey, we're doing this, anybody who wants to come. I think some of the things that we need better mechanisms and protocols around is how that announcement and invitation happen, so that there are more people in the room and a more diverse group of people in the room. We've gone from board meetings where there's just people who are on the board to meetings where there's 20 people in the room and you have no idea who's who. And those are the awesome ones. The difference between those is when I have time to go out and invite people. So again, having mechanisms and systems in place for having that openness be the best it can be, and create what is possible in terms of inclusion. And it's one of the reasons that I've always been excited that we don't have to have one of these and two of those on the board, because if you are inclusive about inviting people into decision making, then it doesn't matter if they're officially, because you'll never have one of everything on the board. And if you do, is that actually representation, or is that just BS? It's the way the structure has said you do things. You just find one of everything and you put them on the board, and there you've got inclusion. Are we actually
That's
including
box
people?
checking.
That's exactly. Yeah. And or are we actually being inclusive in inviting people into conversation? And I think I'm sort of keeping a doing list, because I think focusing on how what it takes for us to get to the next level of what our openness allows, I think is really important. What else is occurring to y'all?
Just to build on what you were just talking about, that it maybe connects the doing to the who. I don't know if you want to go there or not, but it sounds like we want to consider that not just relying on you to be the person doing the inviting and getting people to come, but there needs to be some kind of leadership team or a group doing that, as well as, I guess, other things. And that kind of connects to my email back to you all earlier about this topic, and thinking about moving past the idea of having to separate this group, whatever we call it, from the people, separating the policy making from the doing, I guess. Instead, can we think about how those are integrated, and maybe that means that there's a core group of people involved, but it's also about whoever kind of shows up is part of that decision making.
Yeah, and part of just for anybody who might be watching who has not been involved in the conversations, the structure that we are building, and that is actually in place for the small programs that we do have, is that decision making is happening where it is where people are most affected. And so, and by the people who are affected. So it is not, well, we've got a team of people who lead the consultants online community, and they'll make the decisions. No, the watchword has consistently been, that's not for us to decide, that's for the community to decide, because the community owns the community. At every point where decisions have to be made, having them made as inclusively as possible, but on the ground, locally, where that decision is most applicable. Taking that kind of decision making out of the hands of a board or a CEO or a whomever, and just making it by the people who, because I loved what you said in your note, Angie, that if these are the people who know the most about what's going on, why are we taking decision making out of their hands and saying that somebody else has to make that decision? But I think that there are a whole lot of doings around ensuring that decision making is being rooted in catalytic thinking. So I think that there's another mechanism there, that the way that we know that decisions will adhere to our values and lead to the best possible outcomes is that they're rooted in catalytic thinking. I think there's another doing piece there. And Justin, I want to get back to your thing about efficacy, because I think that comes right back to when we were initially talking about this as an integrity team or an integrity whatever. The ongoing conversation with people who have expectations of us. We made that long list of who all are the people that have, the various stakeholders who have expectations of us, meeting those expectations. And one of the questions that sort of came up in that cycle of, we ask them what their expectations are. We ask them, is this a way that might, meet those expectations so that we can share with you what we're doing? Find that information, figure out who to ask and what the questions are, report that out, ask, hey, did we do okay? Is there more that you'd want to know? And then that cycle continuing. I think it falls into the who is being asked and what questions are we asking to know, are we accomplishing what somebody has the expectation that we're going to accomplish? Are we accomplishing what we said we were going to accomplish? I think there's a huge amount of mechanism that gets away, that leans more towards, and I'm going back to Elizabeth, leans more towards learning than it does sort of learning what works, rather than, yes, we did it and we're responsible for curing climate change because we said we were going to do that. No, what are we learning about the work that we're doing? And so I think that there's a big piece in there about who do we ask? How do we ask? What are the questions we're asking? How are we defining efficacy? I think there's a really, really big doing piece in there.
So on Justin's point about efficacy, I've for those who aren't, for those who can't see it, I've just shared with everyone else taking part something that we developed here in the UK called the Charity Governance Code, which is meant to sort of, instead of being about rules and being about must-dos and being a sort of a regulation thing, instead it's about a set of behaviours and about trying to encourage sort of what are the right things to do and an efficacy. It talks about having a culture, behaviours and processes that help us to be effective. It talks about having a board with appropriate skills and knowledge. It talks about working as an effective team, and then finally about taking decisions collectively and confidently. So some of that stuff, I think it strikes me as cultural, but it is possible to codify some of what Justin has talked about, and it's very much, yeah, from what I can see, it's about how we behave together. So maybe that then comes back to your earlier points, Hildy, about who happens to be at the meeting, and you still need some sort of sense that there is a core group of people who have power vested in them.
That last phrase, go deeper into what you're thinking about with a core group of people who have power vested in them.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, I seem to find myself in lots of conversations these days talking about power, usually along with the words privilege. I guess I wonder, I'm asking the question, is when you see all these sorts of conversations about sort of new ways of running organizations and so on, sometimes do some of these conversations, do they shy away from the reality that sometimes, you know, there are a group of people within there who are invested with a certain level of responsibility, and therefore we have to give them the power to take decisions. And
We lost the last few things you said because it broke up.
yeah, sorry, my Wi-Fi is not very good. I guess I was thinking that do some conversations around sort of these more networked approaches to governance, do they sidestep the reality that sometimes if you need to move on, you do have to invest in some people the power to make decisions, and you have to delegate that authority to them. But quite often we talk about the board delegating downwards to the management. In this case, are we talking about the movement delegating upwards power to a group of people that we have called the board or the leadership group?
The way we've talked about it, which may not be what we build, the way we've talked about it is taking taking that perceived power that boards are perceived to have. I really have perception in there because I'm not sure that there's real power there, and putting it in the hands of the people that are doing the work, and that are doing the work, receiving the work, being part of that are the most directly impacted, who know the most to make those decisions. And to me, decisions, it's the power is the power to make a decision. And so and we can, you know, we can revisit that, but I think that's having the whole concept that there is a group of people who make every decision about everything. Even in the big sense, even in the strategic sense, it just seems anathema to the way things actually work, and anathema to what would create change out in the world is if people can make their own decisions about their own communities.
I don't disagree with that. But there's something funny going on sometimes in organizations, because the people on the ground doing the work, they think that the board's got all the power and they make all the decisions, and the board, you quite frequently find in organizations, think that they don't know what's going on, and it's the people on the ground who are making all the decisions and that they're being left out. So something's not working in terms of how the two parts relate, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that really that whole mechanisms for decision making, I think, are going to be important in this distributed decision making network. I think that the mechanisms and protocols for decision making and for ensuring that those are being followed are going to be key to adhering to our values, adhering to the expectations people have. Yeah.
And this is where I would need to do a little bit more research, but I think there has been some, well, first of all, I think there's been a lot of excitement about movements like Extinction Rebellion, as I think I might have talked about once before in a meeting, and about how these new social movements, and you know, they have a very devolved approach to decision making. But I think some of the analysis of them has sort of concluded that maybe the decision making isn't quite as devolved as they would have you believe.
Yeah.
So I guess going back to what we mean by some of these terms, I come back to decision making and I think about the type of decision, because I think there is the decision to act, which is what, when people actually do something like I'm gonna show up, I'm gonna run this program, that's sort of the operational. So there's that decision making component, which I think, really the power of those decisions does lie in the people who are actually acting. But I think then we also have a distinction, which is the decision to frame, control, constrain. That's the power decision. The decision that is not actually action in and of itself, but it is what puts the parameters around how others are supposed to act and how they're supposed to make decisions around action. And I do think that there might be something in differentiating between that, sort of trying to suss out, is this a decision to act, in which case we want to act in a way that is humane sort of and equitable and has efficacy. And usually we can see that because we can see the direct action and we can evaluate the action and we can be clear, we want this outcome from that action. I think it gets murkier when we think about decisions that are framing decisions and really power decisions, constriction kinds of decisions, guidance kinds of decisions, because
Can you give an example of one of those?
well, it's all policy stuff. I mean, that's all policies, when we talk about that, an entity creating a policy, what we're doing is we're saying we're making decisions about how action is supposed to be taken in the future. Or so, whether it is, as mundane as, how many people need to be present in the office for it to be open, or under what conditions, do we shut down for snow, as Vu's experiencing. So, but I think that when those policy type decisions are made, we often get disassociated from those values of equity because it's broad, it's it's harder to dissect, and so I really think that this idea, at the heart of creating the future of inquiry, is really making sure that we're actually analyzing the questions that are being asked, because that's at the root of creating the future. Is we will change things by the questions that we ask, by the nature of the questions. And what we need to do is we need to give people power to understand what that nature of questioning is. Is it questioning that leads to true discovery? Like, and again, that's where I come back to the efficacy. Like, is this working? What do we need to understand? What don't we know? Who's getting impacted versus questions that have just an affirmative purpose. So what's the best practice? What does everybody else do? Those are the types of things those are not the questions that serve us. The questions that serve us are the discovery. And so I think we need to create some guidance and parameters so that people feel like they know how to interpret those types of questions, and to be able to interpret, was the answer just an affirmative? We should do this. This is a best practice. This is the way it is. This is the versus the, I don't know what I don't know, or is that really working the way we thought it would? If we try that, will it work for us? If it's a quote unquote best practice.
We will never do best practices.
That's the.
Let's unmute.
That's the thought that's been going through my mind here around this conversation. And I was looking at the charity governance code that Carl was referring to. And I was thinking of it with the overview of best practice. I mean, it has some of that sort of feeling to it when I'm looking at it. And I'm also wondering, as we talk about this, is again, definition of terms. What do we mean by the words that we're saying? And as you started to give examples, Justin, of what you meant, it started to clarify in my mind, because I had a different interpretation entirely of what those words meant and what I'm doing it. So I think it's going to be very, very important that be there. And I love the example. Are the questions leading you toward, wow, what don't I know, versus I must do it this way. And I think that differentiation, I think that also addresses what Carl was talking about at the beginning. In essence, this has got to be fun. It's got to be attracting people. It's got to have people, who want to be part of this because they see themselves in it, and they see themselves in the, quote, decisions that are being made as, be it a movement, an organization, whatever it is that's going on. They're part of it, as opposed to just cogs that move it to the next notch along a very, very mechanical system of where it's going.
I'm having a thought. It is unformed. I may babble and it may make no sense. Everything we're talking about here, if we remove those words board and governance from our lexicon, and the concepts that are attached to them, and knowing that there is nothing that those three people, and all it's legal is three people. I mean, in Arizona, one person, and you have a board. The IRS would like to see three. Okay, so let's call it three. If there's nothing legally that they have to do, except exist and not steal money. All of these functions that we're talking about are functions that are inherent in doing the work. And by coming back to this body who shall not be named and making assumptions that those three people, those 10 people, those 200 people are the ones in charge of that. I keep coming back to, I think there's power in saying those three people are there because they need to be there. And now these are mechanisms that are what it takes to run a effective, values-driven, movement-like thing, not even organization, amoeba, that actually has impact in the world, that people feel empowered. They feel like when they come together, they enjoy themselves. They are asking questions that lead to I don't know, there's just something there that says, this is an everybody thing. And what happens if we infuse everything we do into these things, into every, and right now, all of our strategy meetings are, it's not just our board meetings, all of our strategy meetings are open and participatory. And we just finished a communication strategy. The entire thing was streamed online. And people were participating from all over in what would supposedly be the proprietary thing of communication strategy. If we embed concepts, our values, our openness, our inclusion, our effectiveness into absolutely everything, and create models that do that, and then we just say, yeah, we got these three people, they meet once a year and they go, all good. There's just something there that's telling me we need to completely ignore those three people. And we need to say, how are we doing our work? Are we being effective? All of the questions that we're all asking here, that all of that is everybody.
Well, so I go back to Angie's comments in your email about sort of this function and when we don't see it. So we rarely hear people say, where was the board when everything functions well? They say, where was the board when something doesn't work? And it's not, what that tells me is it's not a reflection of the board, it's a reflection of the organization. And I think this goes back to Angie's point, which is, and I think some of what you're saying, Hildy, is if the organization is well governed, it doesn't need a governing body because it's built into, and I think part of that transparency is we still do have to have some accountability for someone to just ask, is there efficacy? Is it culminating in being well governed. Because again, when organizations are working well, the issue of the board as a governing entity is moot. We don't hear that. You know, we might hear about, you know, the strategic, the financial, the other benefits that the board brings as an asset, but we're not hearing about, you know, the governing discernment that's happening at board meetings, you know. So I do agree with that, that if we take that notion and say what ensures that the organization is operating with efficacy and is by result well governed.
Yes.
It's not a governing body. It's a it's a process. So it's not an entity. It is a codified process that
Function.
people can engage with. And again, that's where we really have to look at, you know, is the engagement with it humane? And I love having fun and energizing and curious and all of those things. But are we creating that process that actually defines that specific space? Because I think that's, like, when I think about working with organizations, usually all I'm doing is creating thinking space. To Angie's point about, you know, this facilitated conversation is, how do we build the process that builds in this efficacy and integrity conversation up and down through action decisions, as well as policy framing decision making, that just says, have we paused for a minute and asked the questions which we believe are the questions that change the world? And have we given time for real authentic answers to present themselves? Because that's the other thing that I think we always short circuit, is we look for the quick answer. And, you know, again, that's actually where my comment about, you know, the comfort of white males making, you know, quick decisions is, you know, there's this discomfort that happens when we put up there in the space and say, we might not know the answer. So now what do we need to do? And, you know, what is the process, again, that builds that in? Because my belief is, if we build that process in, the system will be self-correcting.
Part of where my brain is going comes from a thing. Most of you have read the SlideShare that I did and recently updated on this thing of moving beyond Sisyphus in social change, moving beyond the fact that everything seems stacked against people and organizations that want to create change. One of the big issues that I have is around learning and evaluation, and I will link it back to what we're doing here very, very quickly. What we are constantly in a cycle of is we're going to do this thing, and I mean, I'll use food banks because they're so easy. We're going to feed people, and efficacy is, did we feed people? And that's what they go on. I mean, they're constantly, I mean, we talk about outputs and outcomes and all of those big words, but food banks are so consistently in the realm of how many tons of food they pumped out and how many people they gave food to. And we really have no idea, in the realm of making sure our population is healthy and strong and in a position to participate fully as a citizen. We have absolutely no idea if feeding them, constantly churning food out, leads to that. We're not asking the question, and we're not learning. And because when we evaluate if a food bank is doing a good job, what we're evaluating is if that food bank did what they said, but not if they shared what they learned. We always tell them, oh, evaluation's about learning. But are you sharing what you learned about what works with everybody else in town? No, because we have to stay proprietary. We got to compete with everybody else in town. So we're not going to share what we learn. And what I have been thinking about for a very long time is, what if the reason for a group to exist is to learn what works and share what works, not to do stuff. And that the doing stuff is the tool you use to learn what works. So we're going to keep feeding people, but we're doing it not so that we feed people. We're doing it so that we learn if that works. And then we share what we learn with everybody else. And the thing that I'm hearing in what you're talking about, Justin, is learning what works. That you're really talking about, are we learning what is effective? Are we learning what keeps us adhering to our values? And one of the words I scribbled down as I was writing is, next to effective and values and inclusive and open, I wrote actively. Are we actively effective? Are we actively adhering to our values? Are we actively inclusive? Are we actively open? And what are we doing to evidence that we are? And what are we learning from that? And is this a proclivity to learning what works versus a proclivity to just taking action and doing and saying, well, we did it and there's your checkbox? So I know it's a lot of babbling, but I'm really feeling that this is the stuff that needs to be embedded into everything everybody's doing within within this network of creating the future, is asking those questions. How are we going to upfront define if this is effective? What are we going to look for? What are the mileposts along the way? How are we going to share what we learn with everybody else? And again, separating that out from this thing that the IRS thinks we should have. And I'm going to stop babbling now, but I'm really, part of what I'm seeing is that these are the questions. We can just build these things. We can build them and immediately institute them if it doesn't have to be a quote board that does it. If we're going to infuse all of this stuff into every program, we can do that right now. We can scribble it down and say, here, go.
Can I just jump on there? I agree with where you're going with all this. I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about, one way to think about it is we separate out this whole board question and it's out there, or it's just integrated into everything we do as well, in that the same people who are being self-reflective about learning and figuring out what the program should look like are also the people that are essentially the board. I mean, or whatever we call it, whatever the IRS calls it. In a way, I think it makes sense. The legal constructs are out there and force us to create some hierarchy. But we don't really, that hierarchy doesn't really work for what we're trying to do, which is create change, right? Create a movement. When I think about social movement organizations, or for example, the organization that we started here around transportation advocacy, it started out as a group of people who wanted to try to change the narrative around how we talk about things. And the same people who were doing that work were also the people deciding how the group should operate. Ultimately, we created a nonprofit organization because we had to, because of the way that was the only way we could operate to get some things done. But that time when we were, and in a way it still operates this way, it's really a grassroots thing trying to create this movement. There are limitations to that sometimes, but that sort of model, I think, where really the governing group is the same as the people doing the work, and it's integrated, it's self-reflective, seems like this is what we're talking about.
Yeah. And if you wind up having 200 people, 300 people, and we're talking about a network that is global. If you wind up having, then that becomes your decision-making body. You've got 200, 300, 400 people who, if we are adhering to our values, are making decisions first by asking and listening anybody who will be affected by that decision.
And there are good models out there to do that kind of process. So,
Yeah. That if you are doing any kind of program and you're not in a constant inclusive engagement with the people that you're doing the program with and for, that are the people who are impacted by whatever you're doing, that's what we're looking for, is making sure that that conversation is a constant ongoing. And it's just feeling like just what you said, Angie, that it's everybody.
Hey everyone, it's Vu. Apologies, I think I will start to babble now, inspired by Hildy. I think in some ways we really overthink progressives. We overthink things way too much. So I do think that learning from the conservative movement, which is like, I don't know, we just spend endless amounts of time just thinking about stuff, when maybe that's not what we should do. Maybe just like you said, just select one. It's not going to be perfect. We just need to implement it because we have other things we need to think about. One thing, I don't know, and I think I see this pattern repeatedly in groups of settings with progressives. And actually there was one time where it was like 50 progressive foundations and they were all talking about racial equity and so on. And for an entire hour of the 2-hour meeting, they went and said, oh, you know, we're trying to be comfortable with discomfort, and we're trying to center race and decenter whiteness and all this stuff for like an hour. And then it was my turn to speak. And I was like, I don't care about your comfort or discomfort. People of color we don't care. The reality is you've been having these conversations over and over, and still less than 10% of the funding has been going to people of color-led organizations. Your comfort, whether you're uncomfortable with race or not, we don't give a crap anymore. So whether or not you're comfortable or not, we don't get, you can center whiteness all you want as long as funding is moving towards communities of color-led organizations. So the reality is whatever we're trying to do, if it's not actually moving towards what we're trying to get to, what's best for the community. I mean, why do we change systems if it's actually not going to lead to the things that we want the society to look like for this ideal future for us? At Rainier Valley Co, I'm no longer at RVC, so I have to use they now. I might lapse. But anyway, when RVC was founded 5 years ago, it was really to challenge many of these established norms. And we started having this sort of this board, this governing body, and I think it yields some really good lessons, which is in the beginning, it was very diffused. It was people, organizations, and leaders of color, a few white allies, and people who are interested in capacity building, and those who are on the ground who are leading organizations, et cetera, and who live in the community. And in the beginning, it was very huge because we had no staffing. And so it was this huge board of people, anyone who was interested in doing this work. And they were involved in various different committees. So the first thing that I did that I thought was pretty smart was got a whole bunch of people. I was the only staff. I got a whole bunch of people together. There was 80 people. And I said, look, y'all, I can't do this by myself. You need to each sign up for a committee or two. And I created 8 committees. And the board, you know, all these people joined various different committees. So they were doing both the committee work and the board work. And the board meetings were like 20 to 30 people from all over, and anyone was welcome. And it was really amazing. And then as we became more and we started hiring staff, and what happened was that there were all these conflicts between the people who were on the board and then, you know, who were also on the committees doing the work. But now that we have staff, and so who was in charge of which committee? Is it the board member who was the committee chair? Was it the staff member who was taking notes? What was it? So we became more and more like this traditional board model. And I think in many ways, we kind of lost this sort of magicalness of like everyone being on the board at the same time. So I do think that that's one of the things I would go back and be like, how did this work so well? How could we preserve this? But instead, because of efficiency, we decided to move straight into the traditional board model because it is more efficient. Everyone understands it. So I guess my rambling is, you know, I think we got to think about, well, what are some things that we need the board to, what are like a good board? what does it look like? It looks like it represents the people that we're serving, for one, right? If it doesn't have that, then that's clearly not a good board. It doesn't matter what the governance structure is. So I don't know, maybe what we need to do is think about a few key principles that would allow us to explore some of these models or try something out. And then we just got to try a few things. I do like this idea, I think you brought up, Hildy, of having this group of 3 people, we can call it whatever, who know very well that they are a figurehead and to be pulled into whenever there is some sort of legal responsibility, fiduciary responsibility that needs to happen. And then there's this community board, and that is in charge. And when we had that community board at RVC, it was really great. They were, because everyone was knowledgeable, because they are from the community, they were able to tackle some very difficult strategic things. There was one point when RVC was talking about whether we should move from being just focused on immigrants and refugees when we started. And we were only focused on immigrants and refugees. But then we had community members from the Black community, the indigenous community, who were like, well, what about us? How do you leave us out of this movement? And one of the best things that happened was this board actually got together, and because it represented the community, was able to tackle this very difficult conversation and was able to come up with, you know, the decision to broaden this to all communities of color. And that was like a really great conversation that made everyone feel like they were engaged, because this is something that they understood, and it was values driven conversation. It wasn't about technological or, you know, technical skills and things. So that's one thing. We also freed up the board from doing traditional board stuff like fundraising. So maybe kind of taking away, like, there's like 2 things we gotta think about. Like, there's like the board governance, you know, like setting policies, the fundraising aspect, and then the accountability of the ED. If someone, you know, hates the ED or they're a terrible person, how do we actually remove this person, etc. So there's a few key functions of a board that I think we need to think about. But I would say that, I don't know, I don't think we're going to get to a perfect model. If we have, it would just, you know, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We're just going to have to try. And maybe there's just too much pressure on us to try to create a perfect model that could be replicated everywhere. So maybe what we need to do is create a set of principles that we need to replicate everywhere, because the models may change based on the needs of the communities.
Yeah, what's occurring to me as you're talking, Vu, is that the reason that initial board with all the committees and everybody doing all the work, the reason they were effective at making those kinds of decisions wasn't because they were a board, it's because they were everybody. And so I just keep going back to the fact that we keep coming back to these words, boards and governance. I think that this whole, we keep going back to the picture of the fish, and thinking that it needs to be this fish. And one of the things that we have envisioned in this structure, in this networked platform, is that there won't be an ED. There will be, there'll sort of be nodes and hubs of folks who are coming together around things, and there'll be coordinators of those hubs. There may be a coordinator of everything. I can't even imagine there's a coordinator. The way that we've sort of envisioned it is that it doesn't, what we have in communities that works and is powerful is when community members are empowered to do stuff, and everybody's taking on a role and they're coming together. And it's not because Mrs. Smith is the boss of everybody, and she says, or that we all have to come together because we voted that Mrs. Smith is going to be. No, frequently it's because we're all going to get together in Mrs. Smith's house, and we're all gonna, and then next month we'll be at Mr. Gonzalez's house, and we're all just going to get together as community members and get shit done. And there's this whole notion that as organizations get bigger, and as you mentioned at RVC, gain staff, we bureaucratize, and we take away all of the good stuff that actually gets people energized, gets stuff done. And we turn them all into roles and functions and policies. And I just keep coming back to, is that what creates social change? Is that what is going to create the world that we want? And you know, your example is perfect. Is that when it was everybody making the decision, then those decisions were powerful and strong. And I'm really feeling like if we were to ask the question, what embodies all of that? What ensures, forget boards, what ensures that our organization is actively effective? What will ensure that we're actively adhering to our values? What will ensure that we're actively inclusive, actively open, actively legal? What would ensure that? I think if we ask those questions, I don't know that we would get to, we need 3 people, or 10 people, or 20 people. And I'm excited to think about building that. Go ahead, Angie, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Justin.
Well, I just wanted to go back to something that Vu said, and I think, Vu, you said this in the last meeting, not that I'm expecting you to remember, but I believe you gave an example of staff being empowered to make decisions and them struggling with that, like not, and almost not trusting that they actually had the power or the validation that the decision was going to be. So I see you nodding, so I think I got that sort of right. And I think you're saying a similar thing with when, and Hilda, you were talking about this, when it seems that it is a group of peers where everyone's opinion is validated. We are, I feel like in that context, we are naturally searching for validation. We're looking to others. We're saying, is this right? Even Vu, your example, like, is it right for us to just have this perspective or this focus, or do we need to change that? And what it sounds like is happening is when we ask the questions and we land on an answer, we ask a follow-up question, which sort of says, what's the basis of that? Was it an assumption? Is there actual evidence? What would validate the efficacy of that decision or that conclusion? And so I think in all of this that again, sort of no matter what the structure is, the nature of the inquiry is such that it is asking for some of that validation. Is what we're trying to do true? Do we know that that this works? If we're making a decision to do X, what validation do we have that that's likely to actually work, or that that's going to result in the way that we do? And I feel like, particularly as organizations professionalize, we actually, part of that bureaucratization is we neuter people of their ability to validate. And to validate from lived experience, to reach out to the community. And I mean, that's part of what I feel like, you know, that's the euphemism when we say, you know, community input. What we're saying is we need the community to validate what we're doing. Mm-hmm. Now, there are 2 avenues to that. One is they're affirming what we're doing, whether they agree with it or not, and we're sort of covering our butts. The other is that it's actually authentic, that we're saying, we have an idea, we have a construct, we have something we're trying to do. We need the people who actually are those affected by this to validate, to provide the evidence that's there. And in that, we're asking our organizations to be incredibly porous, which is antithetical to every system and structure that is organization. I mean, it is, everything points towards not doing that. Everything drives. I mean, even Vu, as he was talking about, a staff member was taking notes. And it's like, whoa, wait, okay, there's already this construct that when you professionalize the board, the staff members become support, not actually peers in the
So
leadership.
let's come back to this organization. Let's in this, what are we going to do? And I will share, I'm feeling a sense of urgency. I am feeling a real sense of urgency that we have talked about this for a long time. I am feeling a real sense of urgency that we need to take some action. We need to build a set of bylaws instead of constantly saying, yeah, these are just cookie cutter bylaws. We need to build something that actually represents who we are. We need to have some systems and protocols that when people say, you know, so that we can answer these questions. And I'm really eager to, whether it's just dive in and build something, but I also want to know who among us is going to build that. Who's going to do the work that it takes to, whether it's write the bylaws, whether it's write the protocols, whether it is bring together community members to say, we don't know, well, let's bring everybody together because that's how we do things. I am really feeling the need to move to action for us. And if what we are talking about is the question of what is going to ensure that we're actively effective and adhering to our values and inclusive and open, then what are those mechanisms, and let's build them. And I would just love to hear from you all. What do you want to build? Because something's got to guide this thing. And I'll also share with you the reality that I spent so much of last year traveling. I spent so much of last year on planes, in cars. And at some point you look up and go, okay, if something happens to me, this is gone. What makes us, and you all saw this in the goals for the year, what makes us succession ready, that this is systems, this isn't Hildy will do it, or Hildy's got it in her head, or this is the Hildy show. What makes this what it has to be in order to create the change we know we have the power to create?
So there's a lot. This maybe is, yeah, this figuring all that out is maybe going to be hard to do all right now, but I think moving to start, I really like the idea of everybody who wants to be involved at this point is on the board, and everybody on the board is involved kind of situation. And we can articulate that in the bylaws. I think I'd be happy to help work on that. You know, can we go towards a structure of creating some teams or committees or whatever you want to call them that are taking on these different areas, so that it isn't all, you know, you, Hildy, organizing each, you know, strategy meeting or what have you? Is there a way for us to start reaching out to people to ask them to take on leadership roles, and we come up with a system for decision making that would kind of integrate across those leadership teams, something like that to get us started.
Yep. The other part is, if it is reliant on me, it won't get done. You know, you all saw the list of everything that we're trying to accomplish this year to scale the impact, so that by the end of this year, we're ready to, I can either do that or I can do this. And if I do all of it, I will do all of it very badly.
I've never written a set of bylaws before. I'm very happy to contribute and give it a go. It strikes me that we have tools available to us for working remotely together on something where we can edit documents like Google Docs or something like that we could do it in. I am very, very taken by what Vu said before about, sorry to make this a political point, but progressives, and the fact that, you know, we overcomplicate things, and where I would add to Vu's point of view, having just seen it going through sort of an election process here, is that we obsess. I just sort of wonder if we
Say again what we
did you
obsess
lose me
over.
then?
Carl, say over again what we obsess over, because we missed
We
you on that.
obsess about process over outcomes, and I guess what I would sort of say is that if we were doing project management, someone would look at us now and say that we're going for the waterfall approach, whereby we think we're going to get from A to Z in one fell swoop, when actually what we want to do instead is a more iterative approach. So let's just do that language we've used before, that minimum viable set of bylaws, and then let's just keep iterating as we go along. Because you're right, Hildy. I mean, what you call your sense of urgency, I enjoy these meetings, but I do sometimes worry, as I've said before, that we seem to go around in circles, and we've been talking about these sorts of things for a long time. Let's just write something down, even if it's just one side of A4, and then if that's not good enough, we'll evolve it as we go along, because I think that's in the spirit of the learning and the teaching that I think you talk to us about all the time. We are. Did you ever come across that phrase that we should be in perpetual beta, or beta as I think you pronounce it? Our bylaws should be in perpetual beta.
Yep. Yeah.
Well,
I would love to see a set of bylaws that says, because bylaws are about the decisions that we make. How many board members are there, and how often will you meet, and da, 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 da. I'd love to see a set of bylaws that says, in every decision made at every level of the organization, we will use catalytic thinking to make these decisions. Period.
well, I think so.
Oh, I got you speechless.
No, just that. Listen, everyone knows that I'm the first to say throw everything out and start anew. But then I'm also often called to task, which is we have these structures that we do have to work within. And so what's the balance that's there? And 2 years ago, we started this. I mean, 2 years ago, we started drafting, and I remember I talked about it, it's called the why laws. Instead of the bylaws, it was the why laws. Put purpose behind it rather than prescription. And so, I mean, I have the initial draft of when we started working with that, working on, or working within the construct of what traditional bylaws look like. So, you know, I was even starting to work through like, okay, they have this paragraph, you know, how do we rewrite that points people towards the inquiry and the not to Carl's point of overly processed, but we codify the process as opposed to prescribing a state of being. Because usually what happens is the bylaws prescribe a state. And what we're trying to do is to say the bylaws should be a process of continuous inquiry. And so I think what we need to do is we need to sort of within that construct of what people expect bylaws to look like, begin to, because I think we do need an access point that people they'll feel like it's something that they can use as opposed to something
but again, if this is not doing something so that others will use it, but doing something so that we experiment with it to see how it works. You know, if we're writing an academic paper about things that others might try, that's one thing. But if we're trying something ourselves to see what works, I'm really uncomfortable adapting something that we know has not worked. Why would we use the same format when we can blow shit up and start over again? And if we were to blow it up, why have bylaws? I mean, we've had this discussion 3, 4, 5 times over our 10 years of being together. Why have bylaws? People know what to expect when they don't know what to do. Okay, so if that's where I go when I don't know what to do, what the bylaws need to do is tell me why, the purpose, and I think we actually included that in our bylaws. We did make an amendment, maybe not, that said, here's the purpose of our organization, because most bylaws don't even say that. To accomplish that purpose, if you're looking to make a decision about anything, here's what you do. And if that's what we go to bylaws for, I'm really uncomfortable adapting stuff that again goes paragraph by paragraph about stuff that we don't care about. For us, not for anybody else, for us.
Can we just have a one-page bylaw that just to satisfy the IRS who, I don't know. I mean, the bylaws, they're generally pretty useless. No one uses them, except when there's an audit or something. So I don't know. I mean, we can make it broad enough where we could be like, we need to have anywhere between 1 to 300,000 board members. That would give us a lot of leeway to have as many people as we need without having to change anything, right? But I agree. I don't know. I think maybe I do like this Y law framing. So really kind of putting in there, and then I think the problem with most bylaws is that they are very restricting. They're like, oh, we meet once a year, or whatever, or like we don't need to. We will meet whenever we want to. Like maybe that should be what we should put in there. So I don't know. I think we just keep it simple, one page, and then we can move on and try some other stuff. Because I don't know. I guess I'm really excited about the other things that you were bringing up, Hildy, like the evaluation, the sharing, etc., of information and lessons learned. I think that is actually really exciting. And how do we actually get to that? If we can just do this, if we need to have the minimal viable board and the community board or the amoeba or whatever we call it, let's just do it. I'm also concerned because I don't know. I'm also concerned that if we are just trying to create this sort of body to take over the work that you and Dimitri have been doing and have been holding for a long time, I'm not so sure if that would be possible. We have to think about funding and things. And I know, like, I am all for blowing shit up, but there are certain things that just cannot be accomplished without burning people out if we don't have staffing. And someone, maybe we don't call them staff, but someone's like, actually right now, community-centric fundraising is an org that it's not an org, it's a movement that I've been involved in launching. You probably see more of it this month or something, but it's about changing the way that fundraising is being done in the sector. Fundraising is very savior complex and poverty tourism and avoidance, talking about race and systemic injustice and taxes and things like that. And the group decided that we are not going to form an organization. Some of this is inspired by your article a while ago, which is like, we need to start thinking about movements and building movements. And we want fundraising, this movement towards community-centric fundraising, where it's not the Hunger Games, but nonprofits supporting one another, etc. But in a movement, the funding is completely different, right? We are not going to have staffing. What we are going to have, though, is compensating people for their time. And basically everyone there's just, right now we're kind of moving towards this sort of model where everyone's compensated for the activities that they do, not for who they are. So if you are going to do these certain things, evaluation or website, etc., you'll be compensated the same rate as everyone else, which is like a consulting rate of like $100 an hour. And if you're going to be doing volunteering work, then we'll just do the volunteering rate. If you're stacking chairs, no matter who you are, you get $25 an hour. We have no staff, and it's just, this is what we're thinking of doing. But I also think that we have to think about who is actually going to devote the time to advancing this movement, because it just, even if we have 300 board members, there's still going to be someone, like you said, inviting people to come, reminding them about the meetings, etc.
Carl, is it okay if I read what you wrote here, because of your rubbish Wi-Fi? I'm happy to not miss a word of it. What Carl wrote was, just listening to Justin, what I'd love to see is a set of governing documents written for the 21st century, not written in Victorian era language. They should be as simple as possible, clear. When I think about the decisions I make most days, they are moral, ethical, subjective judgments. And for those, I don't need bylaws. I need an ethical framework, a set of values to help me make those subjective judgments. I love that. And a set of bylaws that do that would be so simple. They might not be simple to write, but they'd be simple to read and to adhere to. And what they would do is they would they'd put the onus for all of it right back on the people making the decision.
So yeah, part of just working on the bylaws is also mapping out the kind of structural issues, whether it be how the committees are formed, or if there's staff, people or how, whatever we call them, that are doing maybe the work that you just mentioned. That needs to be sort of going on in parallel with the bylaws.
To give an example of what I just said, and my apologies everyone, because my Wi-Fi is really poor this evening. But my predecessor said to me, as you sort of, the further you sort of advance in an organization, the fewer decisions that you have to make, but the more subjective the decisions get. And they tend to be more moral and ethical as you have to make those fewer more important decisions. So it's interesting just listening to Vu talking about the non-profit Hunger Games and sort of fundraising and so on. And it strikes me that lots of the sorts of decisions that people have to make, they're about things like competing with each other. They're not about what you spend the money on, but those decisions whereby you know that if you go for a pot of money that might be available in your community, what the impact that might be on someone else in the community who then wouldn't win it because you've won it. And those are all subjective judgments, and what you need to guide you in making those judgments is some sort of sense of what's our North Star, what's the right thing for us to be doing if we believe in social justice in this particular space.
One of the things that comes to mind is what is the interface between this minimum entity that we're talking about, the 500-person board, and the systems that exist today for us and for this organization. You know, I'm as we're reaching the end of our of January, and there's tax form file, there's payroll to meet, there's so something has to exist there. So Vu, you were talking about people get paid according to what they do. Somebody's got to talk to the payroll service and make sure that that person gets paid. Does each person do it on their own? So I'm not sure what that means, but it's just making me think about it, that there needs to be some kind of thing. Now maybe it's farmed out. I mean, maybe this is, the payroll service that, does it, or somebody, and I'm using payroll as an example, but there's other things that need to interface with our current world, our current political, our current legal, our current whatever, for creating the future. What does that mean? And so I just want to raise that thought, that I think that there is some, mechanism that needs to be in place for that.
I think there's a lot of examples of success that you've had over the years, Hildy and Dimitri, in how to engage people in these activities. So in the work that you've already done. So if the why laws are grounded in the values, and we talked about those in the last meeting, there's a lot of foundational thought already in place. And when we think about that parallel work, Angie, that you were describing, I think that makes a lot of sense to be able to then, once we name what are the activities of those, if they're committees, that's what energizes people to say, oh, I care about that. And you've done that before. You've found ways to be able to say, yes, I'm excited about being involved in developing this kind of content, or leading this kind of discussion, or building this kind of skill and connection with each other. And so it might be one of those practical steps is to identify some of those content areas, even if it's not the final list, but maybe some of those initial areas that might become part of those committee groups or action groups.
It sounds like the bylaws is a place that folks are interested in starting. Does that seem like a place to start?
I'm happy to do something, and I just want to have a sense of progression, a sense that we're sort of moving on, and I think we have a problem sometimes that we forget that the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yeah. Angie, do you want to run with that?
Like as in work on the bylaws or say more things now?
No. You don't need to say anything. If you want to say
I
yes.
can run with whatever Carl wants to give me. Yeah, I think Carl, also you said that you were interested in that. Maybe we could form a small committee, and Justin, it sounds like you've already worked on some things. So maybe we can consolidate all of what we have into a shared folder. And I was also thinking that I have a graduate assistant this semester, and I could have him do some research as well to find, you know, kind of examples from social movement organizations, or maybe we already have some floating around that we could put together that would be useful.
That would be awesome.
Can I just ask one thing, Hildy? And I think we've done this before. Maybe this is my corporate memory of this board, but did we not take our existing bylaws once before and start to annotate them? Because I guess my opening question is, could we almost have a quick look at what we've got already as a starting point and almost go through and say, these are all the things that we don't like, or this is what's missing? Because we've got to start somewhere.
We did not do anything officially to our bylaws. Our bylaws are the boilerplate stuff that we got from the attorney when we incorporated. Justin made a stab at starting with some stuff that we're looking at some existing headings, existing categories. I am loving, and Carl, you mentioned it as a minimum viable set of bylaws. I'm loving the thought of that. We've talked about a minimum viable board. Hadn't really thought about it as a minimum viable bylaws, but I think that's you know, that drumbeat of as little as possible sounds awesome.
Do we have, this is a technical question, just do we have a shared folder somewhere that we're all, or do you guys use Dropbox or Box or something?
We can use either one. We can use Google Drive. We can use Dropbox.
We don't have an archive where we're sharing our, I have my own box, I guess, folder, but okay.
Nope, but whatever you start, we will continue with.
So I guess where I land with this is sort of two pieces. I think one is there are some legal constructs around the bylaws. I mean, there are, as I was going through this list, there are some things that the IRS is expecting to see, to Vu's point, that corporate structures are expecting to see in the bylaws that sort of have to be documented. That's the compliance piece. Not clear whether it can get all the way down to one page, but I think to Vu's point, like, you know, I mean, that we can make as concise as possible and sort of look at anything that is actually discernment oriented, something where truly you have the latitude to make decisions whatever you want. That it's in that construct that we basically have something that points to what you're saying, Hildy, which is, you know, this will be dealt with in this way using catalytic thinking, or, you know, that to which point then I do think we will actually need a complementary piece that helps frame people to understand what that means. But that doesn't have to be the bylaws. That's much more of the, hey, you know, here are the kinds of questions we ask. Here's what's, you know, so you know, I don't mind resharing sort of that first draft that was, I mean, it's 2 years old now, putting it out there and even culling through, because I tried to flag what I thought was actually a legal requirement to sort of make a statement around versus what actually had, you know, room for interpretation and or, so, you know, it could be that we just take those legal things, we put them there, and then we say all other things shall be determined in this manner.
Yeah, I'm really curious, Justin, do you know, I can't imagine the IRS has all kinds of stuff at their site. Do they have a list of what they expect to see in bylaws? That might be something for you know, in looking at the bylaws, that might be something that could make it easy.
It's more of a state level requirement
Yeah, because
for
I mean,
incorporation.
yeah, some of it is the corporation stuff because it's like, you know, who are the officers or what are the officers, which is actually prescribed. You know, where the corporate records kept, who has signature authority. I mean, those are the kinds of things that, you know, the Secretary of States want, you know, that goes beyond just because you have your articles of incorporation, which really say nothing.
Right.
and then your bylaws have the more fluid pieces, but they're fluid in that they change, but they still have to be declared. And I think most of that is actually, it's more state level, although it's
Right.
pretty consistent. It's pretty consistent what it is, but so we could look at that. I mean, I think some of it too, we can just look at and say, and we think that's just an outright compliant thing. Like, we'll just put it in there. Like, whether it's illegal compliant or not, it's
Right.
just sort of like, hey, someone's going to ask this question. Let's just put it there because let's have it there because it's transparency, it's openness, it reveals kind of the thought process. And then again, anything that I think to Vu's point that I either is so wide open that we just frame it as totally wide open, or if it requires discernment, we say, here's the process of discernment, not a prescription, but say, apply catalytic thinking.
Yeah. Or it could even be, you know, in parentheses, catalytic thinking, but here are the questions we'll ask in the following order. I love and Elizabeth found a link to what the IRS expects. So thank you for that. Which is very little. Yeah. And it's what we consistently keep finding. We keep thinking there's all these requirements and they're like, yeah.
Well, and if you look at the last item under the bullets, there is federal law does not require specific language and bylaws for most organizations. It pretty much says it.
Yeah. But I love the you know, tick the boxes for whatever is legal. And then in all other cases, I really like that approach, Justin. Okay, so do we want to say by when we will have a draft for all of us to take a look at and play with?
Next meeting.
Does that work for you all?
So trying to get it done a week before the meeting or some days before. A draft done.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, so what I can do is, if we determine a place to put it.
I'll do that right after the meeting. Dimitri will get that done.
What I will do is I will, again, because the thing that we have is 2+ years, almost 3 years old. I'm going to go through it, if people don't mind, with that sort of first pass, which is I'm going to just try and clump everything that seems just a compliance piece together. And then, you know, what are the more subjective pieces, put those sort of under a different section, and then we can go from there about how we might want to deal with that. Does that work for folks?
That works great. That works
Sounds
great.
good.
Awesome. I'm excited. If we actually have in the next few months bylaws that represent this organization, I can die a happy girl. Not planning on it anytime soon, just to let you know. We are just about closing time. So what I will ask is everyone, this has been a big one. Take a deep breath. We need to breathe. And if you took any notes, if you've got any thoughts from your notes, let's take a moment and just reflect what is standing out to you from our time together.
I'll go first.
Go.
Board, especially because I've wanted to hear what Vu has to say firsthand for some time, but it's also nice having Elizabeth as well. So I think this a diversity of voices and having some fresh thoughts when we do discuss is always incredibly helpful. I think the second thing that I say, and again, probably a rehash of things I've said before, I do think sometimes it feels like we go around in circles a bit and we complicate things. So let's just get something down and do it. And then the third thing that I think I've been reflecting on as we've been talking is that we are spending a lot of time thinking about, I guess, the bylaws, the rules and the process. And actually, I think the things that ultimately we are interested in are the principles and values. And that should be the focus of our energy.
Awesome. Awesome. And I don't know if I said it out loud, but I put our current statement of our values in the chat box.
Hi everyone, I gave Creating the Future a little shout out today in today's blog post. It's called Drawing a New Fish. And actually there's a lot of people who are having these conversations and they are very curious about what we are doing here. And I think that creates a little bit of pressure, but I also think it creates just an opportunity for us to try something new and manage expectations. I think the fact that we're trying something new is completely mind-blowing to anyone. So we should be proud of ourselves just for thinking of this stuff and doing something different. And it's gonna be challenging, but I don't know. I think it's 2020. We just gotta blow up everything. And the board is just one thing we need to blow up. Grant making, we gotta blow that up. Fundraising, all of that, evaluation. I'm ready to blow it all up. And so it's really exciting. So I'm glad to be here and thank you.
Yay. This is the Blow It Up gang.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Thanks for this opportunity. And I feel like even though, yeah, maybe sometimes it feels like we go round and round, we did make some decisions about some things. So this is good. And also, I mean, I think process is important. And I think framing is important. And so much of it is just about, I think, reframing, and it's so hard to change, you know, our head. So we're having this conversation over and over again. It's sort of necessary to that end.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of blowing everything up. I think everybody in this group knows that. I think, you know, sort of what this conversation keeps reinforcing for me in that is that we actually don't get ourselves caught on what the system solution is, because that's always what we're trying to blow up is the systems. As opposed, you know, if we can think about what we put in place are things that frame desired outcomes, again, the efficacy. What is it that it's supposed to work towards more clearly, so that we're all held to that? Because I think that's what sort of kept coming up was, well, if it doesn't If the program doesn't do what we think it should, we should get rid of it. If the board structure doesn't do what we think it should, then we should get rid of it. But what that requires is that we put in place something that creates an adherence to the outcomes, not the system. And that's what we're working against and so I just keep coming, that's sort of my big reflection, and it is the big challenge. It's easy to blow things up, but everybody's looking for the system. And it is a classic, we lose the outcome for the systems, just like we lose the forest for the trees.
I'm grateful to be part of the conversation and being part of a room of blowing things up kind of people. What was there was a phrase last month that was, the cocoon and the butterfly, taking the nonviolent approach to the total transformation. And this is resonating in thoughts about my work in all kinds of areas and really holding on to the what creates inclusivity and being able to think about all of our roles in that beyond asking people we already know to participate in something that we know matters, but being able to expand those circles of engagement beyond the door's open, anyone can come, but being able to think carefully about how to make sure that we're really being involving and including voices when people do come. So thank you for making that happen today.
Dimitri, I will mute. You can share.
One of the key things that I'm taking away from this is being energized. My awesome was, it's the new decade. Well, it's a new decade for us here and what we're doing. And I'm feeling that there's energy in this, not only in the voices that are here, but also in the reexamination of the things that we've been talking about for the last 4 or 5 years as we've been moving in this direction. So I'm jazzed and excited to see where this is, how this is going to evolve, because it is going to evolve, but how this is going to evolve as it moves forward. Carl posted something just now about a movie called The Italian Job, and a line from the movie that we were only supposed to blow the doors off. So without pulling the scene up, I think it would be an apropos way of thinking about this is, yes, we're going to blow probably a little bit more than the doors off, and I'm looking forward to that. You're unmuted.
Okay, I was typing a note to Carl. I am doing a little happy dance. I am feeling a sense of relief that we are stepping into doing something, that we are taking action. I think that we have looked at every angle of this from every side of this we possibly could over the past several years. I love the fact that that Justin and I spent several months talking to lots of experts that really changed both of our minds about what do we legally need to do, and having the freedom. There's both a freedom and a scariness in, we've talked a lot about the fact that we keep going back to the fish the way it's always been drawn, because that's the system that we have, and we just keep going back to it because it's there and it's the norm. And one of the things that Dimitri and I found when we left the diaper bank, and it is part of why it's one of the things that we've learned and share it quite openly, is that we built, many of you are familiar with the model that we built of a collaborative infrastructure for the diaper bank, the sharing, the collective enoughness model of the diaper bank. It required very little resource. It required just being engaged with all of those people, and required comparatively very little resource. By the time we were done, by the time we left, having anything to do, including being on the board of creating of the diaper bank. The diaper bank was distributing 1 million diapers a year, doing a year-long public awareness and education campaign, and doing all of that for a total of about $75,000. Because everybody else was collaborating on the things that they were already doing. So if a warehouse was already doing warehousing, why did we need a warehouse? Agencies were already processing people. Why do we? And so looking at that model, what wound up happening after Dimitri and I left is that within 2 or 3 years, they brought on new board members, and many of those board members were people who had gone to school for nonprofit management. And they looked at the diaper bank and went, this is not how you do things. And if you look at the diaper bank right now, it looks nothing like what we built. It looks nothing like what we built. They brought on board members who were related to money. And though, because they felt they needed money, because now that they were moving into this realm that needed more money, now we need to go, and they went right back into those systems that, oh, well, if we need money, maybe if we bring such and such on board, they'll bring in some money. And that person went right back to the, well, here's how you have to, and it got more and more bureaucratized, it got more and more. And if you look at the diaper bank right now, it looks just like every other organization in the world. And so when, you know, the brain science behind so much of what we are doing is that individuals will go where systems lead them because we need the comfort in our brains of that predictability. So we go to the thing we know. And this is the way everybody else does it, so we go to that. And what we have this beautiful luxury to do within this tiny little laboratory and grounds for experimenting is to blow shit up and try something. And to show that it works, and then to systematize to the best we can to systematize that. To systematize the thinking, not the doing. So that if a new group comes along, here's the questions you ask. May lead to a different kind of doing, but it's the same questions that you're asking, that are inclusive questions, that are questions around openness, that are questions that embody our values. And so I'm really excited to be working on something and building something that that people 10 years from now, when all of us are off doing something else, are saying, yeah, that's something that we can work within, and we're going to answer it this way, but it fits within all of the values, and that is at the core. So this is just, I know that that's sort of a rambling reflection, but it's very alive for me right now. So I'm just very, very, very grateful to all of you. And I can't wait to see what we come up with. Thank you to all of you, and we will see you next month.
Cool.
Great.
We'll see you
Thanks,
all.
everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.
See y'all online.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.